Hi there, Phil Camden here again, and I want to talk to you about a topic that I've been dealing with over the last 6 years, and I think I've learned a little bit about over the last 6 years in this journey that I have with motor neuron disease, and that is the topic of grief. And I know in my vlog last time I spoke, I talked about that, that the value and the beauty of life is found in its fragility. And I believe that is true. And I think the depth of our grief is also exposed because of the breadth of our love for humanity and for those around about us. And so love, if we're going to embrace life, we're not going to escape the sense of loss and grief that love can lead us into. Because we can't embrace life, we can't embrace love and others without going through some sort of grief when we lose them or we lose the things that we love, and this loss can take the form of many things. The death of a loved one, it may be redundancy. Hundreds of thousands in Australia have lost their job and they're going through loss right now, loss of an income, the threat of the loss of their home, and so they might not catch COVID-19, but the ramifications of this virus is having huge impact on their lives. Business deals that are no longer going through. Businesses that people have worked at all of their working life have now closed down, and there's a threat that may never open again. And so there's grief that's happening that's attached to all of this pandemic that separates, a pandemic that isolates and devastates us and threatens our security and well-being. There's grief attached to that. And I want to tell you, it's not all bad news, because what if I could tell you and show you a way that we can process grief in our life and loss in our life that will lead to a greater depth of love, of joy, a new perspective on life, a new purpose for life. And they're real keys that we can use. And the first one, I guess, is this: when we deal with our grief, don't look at it like it's a spiraling downward. As much as it's a way for us to move forward. Our life is moving forward. Yes, there's loss. Yes, there's grief, but we're moving forward. Philippians puts it like this: forgetting what is behind and straining forward. The Message Bible says straining forward. Sometimes going forward means it's a straining, it's a stretching, and grief is certainly that. It's not a spiraling downward. It's a moving forward. Life will be different, but we're going to continue to live, and we're going to continue to love, and we're going to continue to move through. At the age of 33, Jesus died. So 33 years on this earth, and he impacted the world like no other man. I don't think he wasted a moment of time, and yet there were times and moments that he had loss and grief. In the Garden of Gethsemane, there was great grief where he prayed, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" He got his friends around him. He was sorrowful to the point of death. There was the loss of Lazarus, the one that he loved, and the weeping that we saw him go through. His grief was not wasted, and neither is our grief, if I can say that. Your grief and your loss is not wasted. You may not see any meaning that can be immediately attached to the grief that you're going through. And I understand that. When I was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, I saw no purpose. What is the meaning of this? And really, there was no meaning. Others try to put meaning to it. There's a lesson to learn, there's this and there's that. But for me, going through it, I couldn't see a meaning and a purpose for it. Some have lost children to cancer or to tragedy, and you look at it and say, there's no meaning for that. But the way we deal with grief as we go through grief, we can attach meaning where there is no meaning. Your grief could in itself, or the way we process it, could bring meaning to what we're going through and in life's journey. This is a world full of brokenness. You would agree with that. And grief reveals the truth of that brokenness. I think this is a topic, again, that's needed to be talked about today, because there's so many of us going through loss and grief right now. It's a subject that, again, is not negative, but it's positive. It's not destructive, but it's building. It's not disempowering, but empowering. Not weak, but strong. Not fearful, but courageous. Because if we learn or lean into grief the way we should, we will bring meaning and purpose to what we may seem such meaningless circumstances that we're going through. You know, I believe when we see no obvious reason for loss and grief, we have the grace and the ability to bring meaning to it. Can I first begin by saying sadness and grief, though similar, are very different. Sadness is short-lived. You know, it can be from going from one news report through a commercial and suddenly the sadness is gone. We're sad for a moment because our love is not attached to the tragedy that we hear. You know, we hear that 900 people lost their lives in England because of the COVID-19, and we're sad until for a few days. So sadness is short-lived, but grief is different. Grief is if one of those 950 people was your mother or your husband, and then grief would not be short-term. Grief would change your life forever. You would be different from that moment from before to after that circumstance happened. You know, I heard of 40-year-old Christian teacher in New York who died, leaving 3 young kids behind. And for me, that's sad. And yet for the mother and for the children, for his family, that's a grief that they will live with for the rest of their life. Their grief will stay with them in some form or another for the rest of their lives. And, you know, when I was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, a terminal illness, for those who loved me deeply, it was a time to grieve. For others, it was, isn't that sad about Phil? And I totally understand that, because none of us are going to escape life without the journey of grief. If your mother was to die at the age of 98 of natural causes, then you know your grief would be at a different level and a different depth, and there would be different layers to that if your child had died of cancer before you or died of a tragedy. You know, a parent's grief would be so much deeper than losing your mother who was 98 years old to natural causes. So grief does have different layers. It has different depths. It's life-changing. It's an experience that brings a changed life. There is a before and after this happened when it comes to grief. Before this loss and after this loss. And you know what? It's true. For me, I was healthy before motor neuron disease, and now I'm not. And I will continue to live and love and enjoy life, but life will be different. And so will I. I mean, even if I was healed today or tomorrow, you know, my life would be different since that time, because I've gone through a process of grief that has changed me, not only physically, but internally. It's changed the way I look at life and the way I prioritize life. This will only happen if we face up to grief, if I lean into the truth of what grief is doing. And to do this with any sense of truth, we have to know that with grief, it's okay not to be okay until you're okay, and you will be okay. With grief, it's okay not to be okay, and you will be okay, but not okay until you're okay, if you understand what I mean. You know, when I lost my sense of self-worth and significance after being diagnosed with motor neuron disease, it resulted in me leaving a job that I loved, that I cherished, that was me. And there was great grief attached to that. Now, one of the things we have to understand is grief is not sin. It's a good and godly response to love and passion lost. So understand that grief is not a sin. It's a godly response to a passion and love that has been lost. Sometimes we repress grief because we think, well, it's sinful. But what I learned during this time is that it was not the end of me, of my life, but a continuance of it in ways I never would have imagined. I would get up, but I would be different. You know, it was going to be a straining. It was going to be a stretching. It was going to be a reaching, but not a breaking. And Philippians talks about that. You know, it talks, as I said, it talks about that I'm moving forward, but I'm straining, and grief is that straining. So please don't see what you're going through as a spiraling downwards, but you're moving forward with grief. And here are some things I suggest you do. Either write down, like no one will ever read what you're writing, and it's not going to be filtered by what you believe others will think about what you're writing, but write down the journey of grief that you're in right now. Lament to God as though He is the only one that is listening. Confide in a wise friend, a pastor, a counselor, even a therapist who you can trust with the truth about how you're feeling. Lamenting to God is good and holy way to grieve. It really is. You listen to a lament in Psalm 102, verse 1 and 2. God, listen. Listen to my prayer. Listen to the pain in my cries. Don't turn your back on me just when I need you so desperately. Pay attention. This is a cry for help. Hurry. This can't wait. You see, here is a psalmist writing down his lament. He's going through a time of grief, but he's writing it down. What is he doing? He's acknowledging it. He's moving forward. He's praying. And right after that lament comes the voice of God, the strength of God, the understanding of God. You know, life is lived when you move forward with your story, not by separating yourself from it. And we become integrated and whole and able to move forward with our story when we deal with it in healthy ways. So this week, and indeed in the months ahead, it's going to bring with it sadness for some of us, grief for others. If we are global Christians, we will not just see the blessing of living in Australia at this time and being really relatively safe in the COVID-19 environment as opposed to the rest of the world, but if we're truly global, we will have feelings for those even in third world countries that aren't hearing the news. And so without grief, we would never really fathom the profoundness of love. And grief is only possible because we have loved, and love is ultimately measured by the depth of our grief. Grief's journey, rightly, honestly, and truthfully, will bring new purpose, new perspective, new direction to life. And I believe this new life won't come by ignoring grief, but by facing it truthfully and fully until we change for the better because of it. So write it down, lament and pray to God, talk to a friend, confide in a counselor. Remember, grief is a stretching, it's a straining, but it is a forward movement, not a backward one. You will be transformed by the experience as you face your grief with grace and truth. You will find new perspective, new purpose, you will. So thanks for listening. And if you're on YouTube, why don't you subscribe to my channel, to my blog, fridayswithphil.com. God bless you all.